Someone you love has died, and the first thing you feel before the sadness, before the practical questions, is the need to do something. To not just leave them there. That feeling is not modern. It is far, far older than religion, older than civilization, older than language as we know it. The first evidence of deliberate human burial goes back at least 130,000 years, and what was found inside those graves changed everything researchers thought they knew about our ancestors. This is the story of why ancient humans started burying their dead. Let's start with the comparison that makes human behavior so striking. When most animals die as in the group react but briefly, a wolf pack will linger for a short time and then move on. Elephants are the most famous exception. They return to the bones of dead relatives, stand in silence, touch the remains. Chimpanzees have been documented carrying their dead infants for days, apparently unable to let go, but no other species has ever dug a hole, placed a body inside it carefully, added objects, and covered it over. That sequence of deliberate actions is entirely uniquely human, and the question of when it started and why is one of the most revealing questions in all of human evolutionary history. The oldest confirmed burial sites come from two locations and both immediately complicate what we think we know. The first is Skull Cave on Mount Carmel in Israel, dating to approximately 130,000 years ago. Inside the cave, researchers found the deliberate burial of at least 10 individuals. They were placed in specific positions, some curled on their side, some laid out fully, and here's the detail that stopped researchers cold. One of the individuals was buried with a wild boar jaw placed deliberately in their hands. That is not accidental. That is not the jaw falling there by chance. Someone chose that object, placed it there with intention, which means 130,000 years ago. At least one human looked at a dead person and thought they should have something with them. The second location is cave also in Israel, dating to about 120,000 years ago. Their air searchers found 15 individuals, including a child buried alongside a deer antler placed across the chest. A child with a gift, placed there by someone who felt something. Now here's where the story gets more complicated and more remarkable. Because Neanderthals were burying their dead too. Neanderthals were not modern humans. They were a separate species, our evolutionary cousins. Living across Europe and Western Asia, for most of history, scientists assumed they were too primitive for abstract thought or emotional behavior. Shanidar Cave in Iraq changed that assumption completely. Discovered by archaeologist Ralph Selecki in the 1950s and 60s, Shanidar contained the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals. Several were deliberately buried, one positioned on their left side in a foetal position, and around that individual, they found pollen. Concentrated deposits of pollen from at least 8 different flowering plant species. Yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, woody horsetail, not weeds, not random contamination, flowers. Someone gathered them and placed them with the dead. Now, some researchers have debated this finding. A later study suggested burrowing rodents may have introduced the pollen. Science being science, we acknowledge that, but the deliberate burial positions at Shanidar are not in dispute, and they are not alone. At La Chapelle aux Saints in France, a Neanderthal was found in a rectangular pit, too regular to be natural. At Kibara Cave in Israel, a Neanderthal was found with only the skull missing, removed after burial, possibly as part of a ritual. Across multiple sites, across multiple continents, a pattern emerges. Neanderthals were not simply leaving their dead where they fell, they were doing something intentional with them. The flowers at Shanidar are debated. The ochre is not. Ochre is a natural red pigment from iron-rich earth, and it appears in ancient burials worldwide. Consistently for over 100,000 years, it has no practical function in a grave. It does not preserve the body. It does not protect it. It does not help anything in any physical sense. It is purely entirely symbolic. Ancient humans were painting their dead red before they buried them. Researchers believe red was associated with blood, with life itself. Painting the dead red may have been a way of symbolically giving them life back or sending them forward with vitality. And then there are the grave goods. Objects placed with the dead, deliberately chosen, deliberately positioned at Sungir in Russia. 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried head-to-head and covered in over 10,000 ivory beads. 10,000 beads, each one carved individually from mammoth ivory. Researchers estimate it would have taken approximately 10,000 hours of labor to produce them all. 10,000 hours of skilled work invested entirely in honoring 2 dead children. That is not a practical act. That is love made physical. So we know they did it. The question is why. There are 2 main theories, and they're not mutually exclusive. The first is the practical theory. Dead bodies attract predators. They spread disease through the camp. Leaving them near camp was dangerous to the living. Burying the dead solved both problems in one act. But then you look at the boar jaw in the hands at school, the flowers at Shanidar, the 10,000 beads at Sungir. None of those are practical, which brings us to the second theory. The idea that ancient humans buried their dead because they felt something, and the burial was the expression of that feeling. Grief, not just reaction, not just instincts, sustained intentional grief processed through a deliberate act, and the grave goods suggest something even more specific, that they believe the dead person was going somewhere. You don't pack someone's bag unless you think they have a journey ahead of them. The boar jaw in the hands, a weapon, a tool, a prized possession placed there, so the dead could use it. The flowers to ease the journey, or to mark the grave so the dead could be found. The beads honoring the dead as they would have been honored in life. None of this makes sense without a belief, however early, however wordless, that something continues after death. This is believed to be the earliest evidence of afterlife belief. Not religion as we know it, no temples, no priests, no texts, but the raw fundamental idea that death death is not the end, planted in human consciousness 130,000 years before anyone wrote it down. As time went on, burial didn't just continue, it became more elaborate. By 30,000 years ago, burials across Europe and Asia show clear evidence of ceremony. The bodies are painted, arranged, dressed grave goods, become more elaborate, personal tools, jewelry, art, objects. Other members of the group were clearly present during burial. Footprints and activity marks in the soil confirm this burial was already a communal event, a moment where the whole group stopped to mark the end of one of its members. That is a funeral, not the modern version, but the essence of one. People coming together to acknowledge that someone who mattered is gone. Here's the thing about burial that most people miss. Burial requires abstract thought. To bury someone, you have to understand that they are gone. Not just asleep, not just still, but permanently absent. That requires a concept of permanence, of finality, and it requires understanding that you too will one day be in that same position. That is the awareness of mortality, and it is one of the defining features of human consciousness. No other species demonstrably has it. The moment ancient humans started burying their dead, they proved they had crossed that line. They knew death was coming for everyone, and they chose to respond not with panic, but with ritual. Here's the part that should change how you think about human history. Everything we call civilization, art, religion, philosophy, architecture has grief somewhere near its origin. The first art may have decorated graves. The first architecture may have been burial structures built before anyone built a permanent house for the living. The first communities that chose to stay in one place may have done so because their dead were there. Because you don't abandon your dead, which means the graves held the living in place, and from that stillness, that rootedness, everything else eventually grew. The first time an ancient human knelt beside a body and could not bring themselves to walk away, they were doing something that would eventually produce cathedrals and cemeteries and every elegy ever written. You're the product of every person who ever refused to just walk away. Every grave ever dug was a declaration: this person mattered, this loss is real, and we will not pretend otherwise. That declaration is 130,000 years old, and every time you feel it, you're exactly as human as the very first person who ever felt it.